Alrighty, so for the first video in lesson 1.1G part 1, I'm going to describe or help you understand what the difference between set notation and interval notation is. So let's go back up. So right now I have an example of what your notebook should look like for the start of our notes for this lesson. So I have the title of our lesson, and then I have our learning target. I can define function relationships and describe domain, range, independent, and dependent variables. And then here's the start of my notes section. So in order to eventually understand this learning target and be able to describe domain and range and understand where to look for the domain and range in certain functions, we need to know the difference between, like I said earlier, what we call set notation and interval notation. Now, the word notation is a word that means a way of writing something. So, how you notate, or how you take notes, or how we write things. And so, notation is how we write things in math. And so, these are two different ways that we write the same information. Set notation, you're going to mainly see off and on, and you'll see some of that off and on through some of the notes that you will see, or resources, or even your practice problems for this lesson and beyond. But you're going to mainly see and use set notation more so in high school and your upper math level courses. Interval notation is going to be where we focus mainly on this year in terms of how we are going to be writing our answers for finding the domain and range and some other pieces of information about functions. Again, even though they look different in the way we write, set notation and interval notation is going to communicate the same information. So set notation truly means, or the definition of set notation is that it's a collection of numbers. So in order to show this collection of numbers, we use what I call fancy brackets to start set notation. Then we usually use a variable. So I'm going to use x. And then there's a bar or a vertical line. And then I use the same variable and have an inequality, a number, and then fancy brackets to close it off. So all of these parts of set notation have a specific meaning in math. The fancy bracket, when we look at that, what we say is the set of. The set of. For the x, that means all x values. This bar in words mean such that. And then obviously this inequality here as a whole means x is greater than 0. So let's say I was asked to find the domain of my function. If this is the way I write my domain as set notation, what this means is, in a full sentence, is the domain of my function, and then I basically am going to write what I wrote up here, is the set of all x values such that x is greater than 0. So again, you should have already taken notes in your vocabulary as to what the domain and range is. So when I'm asked to look at a function and identify the domain, I can use set notation to go ahead and write that. And so mathematically, this is how we write set notation, but then in words or in English, this is what it actually means. So let's move into interval notation. Interval notation is a little different because we don't use the fancy brackets. We don't use a bunch of the variables or inequality symbols. You can, but we stray away from that. And so if we use interval notations, instead of saying it's a collection of numbers, we look at a pair of numbers. A pair of numbers. It's an R. Okay. So there's like 4 different ways that we write interval notation. One way is to have 2 parentheses. So kind of, and a comma in the middle. So kind of like a coordinate point. Anytime I use parentheses, what this means for the domain and the range is that the endpoint is not included. The endpoint is not included. 2 parentheses. If I use 2 brackets for my domain or range, let's say, these brackets mean the endpoint is included. Next, I can use a combination of parentheses and brackets. So let's say I have a parenthesis on the left and a bracket on the right. The parenthesis on the left means this number that's going to be here eventually, or this endpoint, is not included in the domain or range. And this bracket over here means that the endpoint is included. And then finally, I could have the bracket on the left and the parenthesis on the right. So same meaning. The parenthesis means not included, and the bracket means is included. So I know this doesn't quite make a whole lot of sense yet because we're not actually, or I'm not walking you through any examples. That will come in the next video. But I just wanted you to get see the difference between how we write something in set notation versus how we write something in interval notation. And again, it's going to make more sense with more examples, but I needed you to have these in your notes so that when I do the next section of notes, you're able to look back on and kind of match what I talked about here and how it makes sense to the next part of your notes.